Okay, good. Resume. So just let's take stock of where we got to before the break. We heard from the applicants team, Mr. Conn, Ms. Fielding, Mr. Waddington. Then we opened it up to a few questions, but I think got a little bit messy because I think we drifted from questions into broader issues. But there we are. Just if I could turn to the applicants team. What further presentations are you going to? Is it going to be just the TVIA that we're going to move into?
Correct. So yeah, we've got our two witnesses for the balance of the sessions today are TVIA and then heritage. So we kind of left through what I understood were the questions for our witnesses, as per the clarifications we were able to offer to Mr. Young. And unless there are any further questions for our witnesses, I think that's probably the end of our presentation.
I've got a few questions. I'm just anything to do with design, townscape and visual impacts, it goes all over the place. It always does, no matter how well you structure it. I just want to make sure that everybody gets to speak, and also I don't want witnesses disappearing if something then comes up and they've left and we wish they hadn't. So if I just turn to the planning authority, you mentioned before the break probably 10 minutes or so speaking.
Yep.
Okay. Just a thought here. Is it worth rounding up the kind of sort of urban design master plan issues first of all and then moving on to the TVIA, because that is probably a slightly separate discipline and it will lead then into the heritage stuff later.
So highly happy with that suggestion.
Yeah, okay. Right, okay. So so where next? So we had questions from others. I think I did ask the planning authority if you had any questions of those witnesses, and was it a no?
That's right, we didn't have questions on
Okay.
the information.
Right, I've got a couple, and they do pick up on some of the themes I was hearing from Mr. Young and to an extent Mr. McCarthy as well. Let me just yeah, well, let me pick up the oh crikey, you have to forgive me, I have so many documents. Yes, let me just pick up with Mr. Field and Mr. Waddington. Is Mr. Conn still with us? Is he listening?
I don't know. Delta are on the
Right, okay.
Teams
Well,
link. Here he is. Yep.
Afternoon, Mr. Conn. Okay. Right. Yeah, I just want to pick up, because I've heard various references to Jersey Architecture Commission. I've obviously got on the inquiry documents, we've got all of the various responses from them. And we heard some comments from Mr. McCarthy on the JAC. I mean, I've obviously got to include in my report, I've got to sum up what the Commission is saying, and then I need to understand the applicant's position and the planning authority's position. Now, I appreciate there's lots of iteration, it's gone through an iterative process, and you've presented to the Commission on a number of occasions. But I'm drawn to the latest submission of the notes from the JAC, and the very last paragraph, I'll read it out, says, "The ambition remains to deliver a future-focused, landscape-led vision for a new district. More emphasis should be placed on how to make this the place of choice to live in St Helier. Creating a new part of any town is difficult, more so in St Helier and Jersey. The plans require further work to resolve climate resilience challenges, to achieve a sustainable community, and to create places that nurture vitality and have a distinctive character that complements St Helier." That's their sort of parting statement on it, and I understand because of the way the Commission's structured, they don't come along to public inquiries, planning hearings or whatever, but that is their last word. So can I just take the applicant's response to that?
Patrick, would you like to lead? Or?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm getting feedback. I'm getting feedback from your end again. Sorry. Yeah. So in terms of our engagement with the JAC, it obviously has been a long process. We've been through seven reviews. I think that there are numerous aspects of their feedback that have been taken on board and incorporated into the plans that you see today. There's a lot of commentary within DAS and within my proof of evidence that discusses that and sets out where their suggestions and feedback have been incorporated. There are elements that they pick up in their final response that I think there's some aspects of their feedback that are to some extent going beyond the scope of this submission in terms of what is within our gift to deliver, particularly around the Rue de Libération and their comments on kind of calming of traffic there. And there are some elements, and as inevitably is the case with these design reviews, where we fundamentally have a difference of opinion with them in terms of the approach to design. I think the comments that they make in respect to the civic squares in particular and the scale of those spaces is something that we don't necessarily agree with, and I think that's something that's kind of set out within our submission documents. I think also, John, has the response to the JAC feedback been issued to the inspector?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So what is?
I will have to check the status of where we've reached with that, sir. The Architecture Commission feedback, I don't have a date on it, was the meeting of the 31st of March, and our team were preparing a tracker as feedback, but I'm not sure where that's reached. Let me clarify that for you.
Okay, there's going to be some sort of rebuttal document.
I will clarify that for you.
Okay. Okay.
I don't think I have anything. Sorry, you go ahead.
Mr. Conn, you were going to say?
No, I think no. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, stay there, because I just want to explore that a little bit further, because I'm just, as we're speaking, I'm just glancing at the conclusions of that 31st of March, the notes of that 31st of March meeting, and accepting that there may be a document that arrives that addresses some of this. I can understand the response you just made. So, I mean, some of it is quite strategic stuff about car ownership and use in Jersey. And then I'm wondering as well, I mean, to an extent, well, I need to understand, where they make all these comments around placemaking, convince me that the reserve matters stage is the time point where that is properly addressed, because you've obviously got a design and it goes so far with parameters and codes. But in terms of the concerns that JAC have about placemaking, where is the value going to be added at that reserve matters stage? Or how are you going to appease their concerns?
Well, I think that, I mean, this goes back to the discussion that we've had already about the role of the codes and the what is for approval. It's something that we have tried to embed within the codes as far as we're able to, without overly restricting the design and the potential for for creativity and individual design response at the RMA stage. I mean, our feeling is that is something that is embedded in the codes. It's set out within the within the parameter plans in terms of the shape of the massing, the volume of those spaces that we create, and then the detail and the richness of those spaces is something that's set out by the codes and will be delivered through that mechanism.
Okay.
Sorry, sir. If I can just add to what Patrick's referenced there, and as Mr. Nicholson highlighted earlier, in response to the detailed applications that we hope will be coming through in due course, we are committed to continuing the engagement with the community, and it will be the community themselves that will influence and inform the design and amenities that these new public spaces, both internally and externally, will provide.
Right. Mr. Common, last question. I was trying to sum up, but I think I was hearing from Mr. Young this morning. I think he'll correct me if I haven't got this correct. There was talk about the parameters being influenced by sort of analysis of the town, so particularly in terms of building blocks, but you accepted that obviously that the heights were different, and also I think there was an acceptance that this is a new character area that would be formed. It isn't going to be a sort of replica of the forms that you would get in the historic town centre. But again, skipping back to the JAC notes in the conclusion, it says the Commission wants to see an exciting new place grow up over the next 12 years. The question at the heart of all the design reviews is, has the design been inspired by and captured the character and atmosphere of St Helier? And then it says, the parameters plans presented sadly do not deliver this. Now, is that just a difference of view in the sense that you define that this will be, it'll take some influences from St Helier, but it will define its own character? Or is it a bit more fundamental than that?
Do you want me to come back on that, sir?
Yes, that was my question. So sorry if it was a bit long.
Sorry, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, the parameter plans, inevitably as parameter plans are not not necessarily the most exciting looking plans, but where that kind of character comes in is within the codes, and those do include extensive codes that talk about things like materiality, referencing the existing kind of townscape of St Helier. They talk about art strategies and various other aspects that can be brought through into the detailed design, or will be brought through into the detailed design through the codes. The approach to planting, delivering something which is of St Helier's character, but is interpreted in a new way. I think that it is the case that we do see this as a scheme that references and takes influences, as Mike's spoken about, in relation to the old harbours and the approach to the architecture from existing St Helier, but it is a different character as well. So I think it's what we feel that we've achieved the correct balance of referencing that existing character and creating something that is a new modern character area within St Helier, and that is reflected in the way the codes have been set out.
I think to add to that, sir, if I may, the develop design stage for each of the subsequent phases is a whole other layered exercise. There's a lot of work to do to kind of take the seeds that are within the design codes and see them grow into a kind of rich, locally relevant, St Helier relevant kind of series of projects. So there's a lot more work to do, but I think the codes do provide the basis for that.
Okay, last question, and I think I'll try to pick up some of what I was hearing from Mr. Young this morning. When I look at the drawing, which what's it called? Drawing 11, which is plot dimensions and edges, which is one of the parameters plans up for approval. I see all the blocks and can go elsewhere to see the heights. Something that I keep seeing is this dimension of 8 metres. 8 metres between what are tall buildings by policy definition in Jersey. Where does that 8 metres come from?
On the plans, it's one of the few pinch points on the site is between E building blocks in the neighbourhood on the lane. So, for instance, between E1 and E2, that's where the 8 metres offset is. And as we mentioned earlier,
Yeah, I'm looking at the plan now, and I can see 8 metres, 8 metres, 8 metres, 8 metres, 10 metres, 12 metres. I'm trying to understand, and it was questions triggered from Mr. Young's point about walking around St Helier, you get to see the sky and stuff. And I suppose the question I think was coming through what he was saying was, with big buildings, and these are taller and bigger than the grain of nearby parts of St Helier, shouldn't you space them a little further apart to let them breathe? Question.
I think we just reiterate the point we made earlier, that when you look at the plan overall, there is much more variety than the 8 metres that is referred to. And, 10, 12, 16 metres is very common. Over 12 metres for a street is actually generous and is allowing a lot more. Where there are pinch points, though, we do have setback recessed courtyards, which take the 8 metres to almost 30 metres. And again, I reflect back on the E blocks as the example in the neighbourhoods. The D in the E blocks is exactly that. So whilst there might be a small pinch point of 8, there is then a dramatic setback of almost 30 metres plus. And so, the blocks haven't been set out in order to block skyline as such. They're about getting the right balance between creating variety and getting daylight into different usages.
So in the design and access statements, section 5.6.11 includes the hierarchical approach to the streets and public spaces.
Five 5.6.11.
Let me get you a...
What page?
Yeah, it's in what I have as the second volume. We start at page 157, for example.
Yes.
So this starts to talk about how the public spaces are created for particular purposes, aligning with the character and use of each particular zone within the parameter blocks. And as you work through this section, each kind of element of the street and space hierarchy explains how it is given those dimensions with regard to its purpose and character. That includes the laneway, which was the 8-metre space that you were talking about. I think the laneway is at page 171.
Yep.
And that explains that tighter space is an intimate, quieter and sheltered alternative to moving through the site on one of the larger parts of the kind of ground plane and street hierarchy. This is running through the character area, which John has just touched on. D1 and E1, they're part of the residential character area rather than the seafront character area. And it gives a quieter space as a residential lane that perhaps if you are living there, you feel more comfortable entering that space because it feels slightly more private. But if you're passing through that area, you might not deviate from the larger streets. So the hierarchy of spaces is discussed through this 5.611 space with commentary as to its approach, its envisaged use. There are visual references to how the spaces are successful in other schemes and how the landscape may work. So I think that continues for the 10-metre streets and the public squares and promenades. And it's that hierarchy of spaces, uses, and characters which is reflected in those parameters.
Okay, so they're not drawn from street widths in St Helier or anything. They're just an assessment of what feels, from the designer's perspective.
I think they are also drawn with reference to some of the spaces that appear in St Helier. The earlier part of the design and access statement includes a review of character and certainly some of the little pinch points and courtyards and spaces that are not friendly for vehicles, which are all over the old part of St Helier. They are referenced in here as that type of intimate space where the pedestrian has priority and that space feels more comfortable. I think Patrick might have something to add to that as well.
Come in on this if you can hear me. I think this also is actually something that goes back to some of the earlier feedback that we had from the JAC. In very early versions of the plan, this was this route, and it's a specific route, as John's referred to as the laneway, that runs sort of between the Jardin de la Mer down to the leisure quarter. And originally, this was a much wider kind of pedestrian spine that ran through the middle of the scheme. Some of the feedback that we had from the JAC early on was to do with concerns over sort of the development turning its back on the Rue de Libération, and they sort of pushed us really to place the kind of east-west movement emphasis on those existing streets, the Rue de Libération and Rue de l'Étau, and so the boulevard as it was kind of rethought as this much quieter, more sheltered, more kind of residential feeling street, as John's just described, and the widths of that were reduced, based in part on comparison with similar kind of laneways elsewhere in the world, and also in relation to some of those kind of finer grained streets within St Helier.
About the distinctive character of St Helier, one of its characteristics is this continual compression and expansion of spaces as you pass through narrow roads, into wider spaces. So there's a direct parallel, I think, with the proposals.
Okay. Right. Are you happy that I move on to planning authority in there?
Of course. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
so we've got Ms Johnson and Ms Ingle, is it? Okay, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll go first and then Tracy will follow afterwards. I just wanted to start off by referring to a point made by John in terms of the outline application, this being outlined, and it's a two-stage consenting process. I think that was in response to a comment made possibly by Mr. McCarthy. And I think it's just important to reiterate that, yes, whilst this is a multi-stage consenting process, the maximum parameters that get determined at this stage are then cemented in place for the future. So future applications can't then refuse permission for heights, for example, of buildings, if this is the authority's position, understanding that anything that comes forward is permissible up to the heights shown on the maximum parameters. So I think it's just worth making that clarification, that once we agree the parameters, they are then agreed in perpetuity, unless they're amended via a planning application. So the presentations made quite a lot of reference to the scheme being presented as a landscape-led framework. And I know we'll be dealing with landscaping tomorrow morning, so I'm not going to labour the point. But I just note that the framework as presented has the potential to deliver improvements to the public realm through new and enhanced hard and soft landscaping. And this landscaping will be an absolutely essential component of the scheme to deliver placemaking aspirations articulated in the design and access statement, and to provide some of the mitigation measures detailed in the environmental impact statement, for example, wind mitigation. However, landscaping is reserved for future determination, and that there are lots of codes that address matters of landscaping and public realm, and these include many prescriptive requirements for matters such as tree spacing, widths of pedestrian pathways and public areas, and routes through the site. However, we do maintain our concern that the enforceability of these codes is questionable. The authority considers that landscaping should have been for determination at this stage, and we know that view is also shared in the feedback of the Jersey Architecture Commission. I would also just make reference to a couple of occasions where the applicant's team have referred to the site as having low sensitivity to change in the St Helier urban character appraisal. I must admit I haven't come across that phraseology. What I have come across is reference to, in that appraisal document, reference to the site having low sensitivity to density, but medium sensitivity to height. The urban character appraisal refers to the principle of up to 8 stories on the waterfront site with a taper to shoreline. But it also does clearly state that where the proximity to sensitive historic features or landmarks makes the site especially sensitive, a more conservative approach to height may be vital. So I just wanted to make that point. In terms of built form, the authority is concerned that some parts of the scheme exceed 8 stories due to ground floor stories considered to be of excessive height, with consequent adverse impacts. Excuse me. So Chapter 5 of the design codes sets out the prescription of future development in the built environment. Section 5.3 explains the approach to the base, middle, and top of buildings. And Design Code 5.3.1, base of buildings, states that the bases of buildings are designed with a minimum of 5 metre floor to floor for commercial use and 6.3 metres floor to floor to allow for duplex residential use. It's the authority's view, as it always has been, that a residential duplex of 6.3 metres should be classed as 2 stories, not as 1. Plots D1 and E1 have duplex units at ground level, so that's 6.3 metres high, with 7 stories above. This has the effect of creating 9 stories of development, and this is confirmed in the design codes. So this height exceeds the maximum story heights envisaged by all policy documents. The applicant recently submitted a schedule of errata confirming that the wording and diagrams in the codes are to be amended to actually make clear that a duplex ground floor of 6.3 metres high should be classed as 2 stories and shall only be allowed to have a further 6 stories of development on top of it. So whilst that clarification appears to provide a commitment that blocks D1 and E1 won't exceed 8 stories, the maximum vertical limits for plots D1 and E1 shown on the parameters plan allow for a height of over 9 stories. So to illustrate this point, we can look at the parameter plan that confirms the maximum height at the southern corner of block E1. So that shows a maximum height of 38.8 metres above ordnance datum.
Sorry, 38,
0.8.
38.8.
Yeah. So it's just the parameters plan which shows the maximum heights.
Yeah, I've got it, yeah.
Yeah. So then we also have the parameters plan which shows the finished floor levels. So if we go to that same point on the southern corner of block E1, the finished floor level is confirmed as 9.39 metres above ordnance datum. So if you use the maximum minus the finished floor level, the ground level to top of the building is 29.41 metres high.
29.41. And that's block E1.
Yeah. And I think it's the same for D1 as well. So then if you use the codes to clarify what a residential story is, which is 3.15 metres, or you double that for duplex, which gives 6.3 metres. So using 3.15 metres and dividing it by 29.41, you get 9.3 stories, which is the equivalent of a duplex at ground floor of 2-storey height and 7 stories above.
What are your commercial floor allowances?
If you then say, well, the highest parts of the buildings are not going to have a residential duplex at ground floor level and it's a commercial use, still having 7 stories of residential accommodation above gives a ground floor height of 7 metres, which seems excessive and not in accordance with the Bridging Island Plan guidance on what constitutes a story.
Excuse me.
Shot. The codes, so I just continue on this train of thought. The codes for plots D1A, D1B, E1 and E2 also make reference to any proposed plant being located within the technical zone for each block, which would be a further 3-metre height addition to the buildings, resulting potentially in heights of up to 10 stories. However, based on the plans submitted, there is no roof plant currently proposed for blocks D1 and E1. It's unclear whether this reference to roof plant is an error or there is no roof plant on any of these blocks. If it is the latter, that there is no roof plant on any of these blocks, then clarification is sought on where the proposed air source heat pump equipment will be located. The sustainability statement submitted as part of the application confirms that every residential building will use external air source heat pumps located at roof level as the primary heat source. The maximum height of buildings is an important consideration when dealing with townscape and visual impacts, which we'll be moving on to shortly. And also just a kind of a final point on this, the schedule of errata is helpful in that it comes back on some of these errors and discrepancies identified in the codes. But there was one aspect that it didn't clarify in the revision that I have, and I just wanted to mention that, and perhaps we could get clarification on that. So design code 5.4.3.1.
So
5.4.3.1
yeah.
states that the maximum building heights must follow both the above ordnance datum and story height maximums set out in the parameter plans. However, the parameter plans do not confirm story height maximums. They only confirm vertical limits above ordnance datum. So I would be grateful for clarification as to what the reference is to the story height maximums on the parameter plans. We also note, as an additional point, that the design codes don't appear to embrace governance and public realm management, which will be important to ensure delivery of the aspirations captured in the framework vision. This point was also raised by the JAC. So the draft density supplementary planning guidance references this as a requirement for schemes with net densities of over 150 dwellings per hectare, which the Planning Authority believes is applicable to this scheme. Thank you. That's it for me. And then Tracy.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I think it might just be helpful to touch briefly on the role of the JAC and feedback made on the 31st of March. For the record, those notes were produced by all of the commissioners who attended that session, and that included David Pritchard as chair. And therefore, that is a common set of issues raised by all of those commissioners present, rather than being a reflection of one particular commissioner's view. The Commission are there as a critical friend and to offer a peer review, and their scope lies outside pure architecture. So it is not how a building looks, it is how it fits context. And it's also there to push back against some of the issues that are challenging for all development in Jersey, which is around sustainability and future-proofing. And it's particularly important for this development because it'll be 2028 or 2030 before the development is likely to be completed. So ensuring the flexibility that this does not set inappropriate use of materials, designs that will compromise the future quality of St Helier is a key aspiration. So the understanding that this application delivers a landscape-led series of spaces and places and streets that are vehicle-free are very much positive and have always been welcomed. But there are challenges here in that the development, while sustainable and on previously used and reclaimed land, is predicated on creating a basement, and that adds significant cost, and that adds significant sustainability issues around the use of concrete into the future, and potentially, in terms of phasing, could actually require the construction of these areas without the flexibility for that to be reduced in the future. And again, based on schemes in London where there's been a significant reduction, and I mentioned London because that's been used as an exemplar, there's been a significant reduction in the requirement for the private car. These underground basement spaces and places become significantly redundant in the future. The sustainability, therefore, is a key component and related to the contaminated land issue that you've heard raised earlier. So codifying in 2023 a response both to sustainability and livability and sustainable community standards needs to be very carefully done. And it is certainly so much more than codifying landscape and codifying architecture. And a point that has been made and will be made, that north-facing single-aspect flats will be required to be mechanically ventilated into the future, and that should not be codified. I'm very aware that the discussion around landscape sustainability will follow later, so I don't want to dive too deeply into rabbit holes, but suffice to say that the response of the Commission is an attempt to think carefully about a response to the challenges of this site. And therefore, one of the issues, the disagreement, is between the Commission and the applicant, is how one should use land. And at the moment, there is a significant green and public open space areas, which are relatively large in the context of St Helier, which perhaps could be used in a slightly different way, which may mean that some of the larger, taller buildings could be refined, fragmented, or changed in subtle ways. That is a proposition that's been rejected, and I understand why, by the applicant, but that is an issue that has been raised a significant number of times by the Commission over the 6 or 7 reviews. So the issue, I think, for this site from the government local planning authority point of view is the challenge of a highly modern development that requires up to 9 and possibly 10 stories to accommodate the challenges and requirements of the site versus its contextual responsiveness on the edge of St Helier. And it is clear from both the St Helier urban character appraisal, the seascape and integrated landscape, that the edges of St Helier are key and need to be very, very carefully considered. And therefore, the response to context, understanding block sizes and the derivation of those block sizes need to be very carefully thought through when dealing with the mass and scale of the buildings that are in front of you. So the suggestion is, in urban design terms, that this is a very significant, large, high and highly mass development that will create potentially large-scale streets, even at 8 metres, with a 38-metre high building either side, will be a condition that has not been seen in St Helier, and therefore finding and exploring different ways to fragment, reduce and descale the mass of this is to be considered further. And that is why, from an urban design point of view, there's an objection to the scheme as it stands.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll just ask a question. Do you have any questions that you?
No, thank you.
No. Okay. I'm going to go, there's a certain order, Mr McCarthy, so I'm going to go to the applicants. Any questions, what you've heard?
I don't have any questions, just some clarifications. I think it's some, the way in which the data was presented. I hope it's clear that we don't have any buildings 38 metres high. Those figures come from AODs. The ground level was approximately 9 to 9.5 to 10.5 metres across the site. So we can take 10 metres off 38 metres high. Heights measured from datum, height measured from pavement when we're talking about the transition through some of the streets. I think that needs to be clarified. Reference to 9 and sometimes 10 stories high. I hoped that we had picked up all the anomalies in the errata sheet. There is to be nothing over 8 stories high, and we are furiously checking with the team who unfortunately aren't here to provide the clarifications which I hope will be with us shortly. But if we need to again look at particular points, we will certainly do that, sir. There is to be nothing over 8 stories, and the heights come up, in my recollection, to no higher than about 28 metres, I think is the maximum figure. One other point which I don't think it's necessary to dwell on, but I just wanted to emphasise the island plan considers a story. It's set out in the tall buildings section of the plan to be anywhere between 3 metres and 4.5 metres. So we don't intend to rely on that as a position that the application takes, but we have set out our story heights in the design and access statement, and typically they are at the lower range of that guidance within the island plan, excepting for ground floors. We consider the commercial spaces through the experience that the project team have in occupier requirements may need a slightly higher internal space to deal with some of the servicing that needs to come down the buildings and be dealt with within the ground floor extents. I think the most important thing to follow up from that is that we will review those anomalies because there should be nothing over 8 stories high.
Thank you. That would be helpful. I think with the benefit of hindsight, this is where perhaps an earlier engagement on statement of common ground would have been useful, because it's really quite difficult for me trying to sort of referee different views on heights, which should be, well, they should be matters of fact, shouldn't they, in terms of what's agreed. Now, I had a wander around the waterfront yesterday, and I was looking at the Horizon development, and never switch off when you're doing a job like this, and just think, well, how many stories are these blocks? And of course, you have this issue around the ones in the middle are quite easy to count, but then you have a very high ground floor, double height ground floor level, and then what appears to be the sort of luxury duplex level on the top. But it looked like some of those blocks were effectively 10-storey.
11.
11 of it.
This is something that I've struggled with for a long time, but the policies that we all have to work with continue to use it. I don't know why height isn't measured in metres. Measuring height in stories, which can be different heights, is not helpful. I think the bottom line is that Horizon is considerably taller, with 11 stories, including a large commercial ground floor. I'm trying to find the right page while we're here, where we can find the actual datum figure for the 3 Horizon buildings and compare those with the datum figures on the drawing 0014 plot parameters. So if you bear with me, I will find that information, sir.
Okay. I tend to agree with you that stories can be, yes, they're relevant. We're going to refer to them in the narrative, but they can be a little bit confusing because, again, on my Sunday afternoon walk around, you look at the Radisson, that's, I think, 5-storey, but they're big commercial hotel story heights, and I don't think anyone would dispute that's a big building. And I think in terms of me capturing this and explaining it to the Minister in a report, I need to sort of present it in relative plain speak and use references such as the Horizon blocks, the Radisson, the International Finance Centre blocks. And I think if you could double check those heights, and I am more interested in metre heights than story heights, that would be very, very useful.
I think
particularly if you can reach agreement on it and it becomes a common ground issue.
Page 124 of the Design and Access Statement provides a really useful context. It gives the...
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. Yep. Thank you.
Right. Oh, that is very useful. So, just to be clear, these figures I'm looking at on here are what? So
They are AOD heights.
Yes.
Okay.
And I guess it's just helpful to, so it doesn't include all of the maximum heights because it's a stepped building with different, there's voids, lift voids and things like that. But yeah, I guess if you look at the left-hand horizon building, which is 40 metres above ordnance datum, you'll see that there are parts of the scheme which are in line with that at 40 metres above ordnance datum. But they predominantly are where we have rooftop infrastructure as opposed to the maximum extent of a land use.
Yeah, I think it is also relevant, sir, that the errata schedule will reference some of those rooftop plant enclosures. And so this, the spot heights on the existing, on the proposed buildings will need to be updated to reflect the actual parameter plan 0014. But in terms of the scale of the surrounding buildings, the spot heights along the Esplanade, the group of IFC buildings, the 2 Castle Quay blocks, and the 3 Horizon blocks, they're all as-built survey information.
Okay. Mr. Johnson, when you were talking through, I think it was block E1, you referred me to the dimension on the parameters plan, which was 38.8.
Yes.
Now, when I look at that, the nearest point I can see on this drawing in the design and access statement is, what does that say, 29, or was it 28.22 or 29.22?
That's block D. Yes, so block E, the next.
Sorry, it's...
That's block D, I think you might be looking at on the image. So
yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so basically next to the, sorry for just doing it like this, but next to the leisure building on the corner here. And it's the same for the other end of block E1.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Nicholson, have you got more to question or clarify?
No, they were the 3 points. There is nothing over 8 stories. The 38 metres is a reference to AODs, not height from pavement, and that we will review the identified anomaly. I can't do that when I'm sitting here, and cross-reference it with their errata schedule, and if it needs to be updated and corrected, we will make sure it is.
Okay, right. I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to be quite strict. They're going to be questions, not general submissions. So, Mr. Young.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief.
I should say, I'm saying that because we are up against time constraints today.
I think I'd like to ask a question. I assume it comes under this because it's under the design and access statement. Ms. Ingle referred to apartments that have only a single, a north-facing aspect. And looking at the drawings that I saw, I may have read the wrong ones, I accept, there were a lot of flats in the new residential buildings that face directly onto this road, onto this, what is now a current motorway. Could I hear whether or not the design and access, what's being proposed, is that is the case, that we have ended up single aspect, north-facing residential units, very, very immediately onto the road? That troubles me, the kind of environment that will create for the residents living there. So I'd like to hear, has that been considered? Is that a fact? Are there any? And just one comment on the heights. It would be very, very good for the public, I think, from that conversation, which obviously you covered very well there between both sides, about stories and building heights, I think to have clarity of what is the actual heights above datum of the horizon blocks, which I think I've certainly had a very large number of comments that they seem to be excessively high. and all compared with what maximum heights are proposed within this plan. So it was in metres. It would be very, very good to have that clarified. So, thank you.
I think we're going to get that. I don't think we'll have it magically, but...
No, but later on, I mean...
yes.
We have the horizon datums here. So
Oh, excellent.
On that page 124.
It's just I think the public do have a view about horizon. It's a yardstick by which they can measure things. So if it's known this is the height of horizon, and
Yep.
you know they're different. Well, they're three different blocks, but they look like they're different heights to me. But I think Lee is nodding. So
Yep. I can refer you to page 124
Yeah.
of the design.
could we hear that on the record so people hear, because that would be useful. Ah, here we are. Sorry, beg your pardon. I apologise for not finding all the paperwork. It looks like 45, 47, 47.4, 43.8 and 40.1
Correct.
metres above datum
Correct.
of those blocks.
Yep.
And the highest now, if I heard it correctly, could I clarify, the highest that you said that you dismissed the argument about we could have 38 metres from the planning authority and said that there would be nothing more than 28. Is that correct?
No. The point about 38 and 28 was with reference to how it's measured. If you want datum figures, I can refer you to the maximum plot parameters drawing. The point about 28 versus 38 was the fact that the pavement is already at 10 metres. So that was the point of my
Okay.
clarification.
I think I've just seen the answer for myself, 36, 37, 40, 29 and 28, but there is a block here at 40 anyway, so I think that if that's still proposed, I think that's a material, because the height is crucial, I think. So I don't want to take up any more time. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Afternoon.
I wonder if I can ask the JDC whether the amount of green space that's being allowed is actually green space, or does it include roads, car parks, etc.? Because green space is vital to the people of St Helier, and I know there's a lot of concern about the way in which the development is going to go, unless there is that 56%, I think it's supposed to be, of actual usable green space that people can actually walk on.
So Patrick Conn, who's online, will be able to correct me on this. My understanding is the 56% effectively provides for the streetscape and as well as the soft landscaping areas. So if there's the pedestrian walkways will be classed within that 56%. So it'll be both hard and soft landscaping. The scheme itself is proposing to plant, I think it's in the order of 550 semi-mature trees. So we're very much focused on ensuring that we create an environment that is resilient and does provide sufficient soft landscaping and provides the level of amenity for the community in terms of activating spaces with play provision, as well as providing open areas for events.
Can I ask planning whether they're happy that is actually green space?
I think we might be drifting into another session here, which one is it?
I think tomorrow we have open space.
Yes. Yeah, we will look more closely at open space and amenity space provision tomorrow. Ms McCarthy, remember what I said?
Oh,
Question.
Well, there's three members of the public here today now. I want to focus on fair.
You're going to focus on answering the question?
No, I'm going to. Yes. It's.
Please.
It's just for those people listening in. I just want to put it just in context of fair and consistent. This is to be a fair and consistent planning application by that is with the same issues would be covered by any private individual. also how serious it is for not submitting adequate or submitting misleading information with omissions. I agree with the applicant how important measurement is, how tall things are. Therefore, I just do not understand why you have not provided any sections of the revised master plan so the public can judge for themselves the heights of buildings between. The other aspect is there's 8 metres that you've been talking about. We call that nose-picking distance, where you can actually see the person, your neighbour, picking their nose. But what is important is visual impact, as in accordance with all good planning policy, starts off at 20 metres away from a neighbouring bedroom or living room. So I think you have to start with that 20 metres and then start to justify that you're not affecting people's privacy as you come closer. So I'd ask, have you assessed the privacy between blocks?
That's another session, Mr. McCarthy, on tomorrow on amenity. We'll be looking at that in some depth.
Privacy?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. But could we just answer the question why they haven't provided any sections so the public can compare heights?
I think there are some section drawings.
Is it in
not
in the design and access statement? Also,
No, there's no drawings. There's no drawings.
Yeah, there are drawings.
No, submitted part of their a planner, any member of the public submit a planning application has to provide sections, and I hope the planning department would support me. They have not provided the minimum requirements expected of a planning application.
Okay, drawing reference 0210, site sections 1 to 5. Drawing reference 0211, site sections 6 to 7. Drawing reference 0212, elevations. The sections are here.
And those sections relate to the previous planning application, not the revised planning application.
Incorrect.
Well, that's what I've seen on.
They're titled addendum. I'm looking at them now.
And when were they added?
Yeah, when they were added would be to the application.
No, when were they made public?
That's not a question I can answer.
They were part of the submission that was published in January of this year.
January of this year. And I wonder if the public are aware of that.
They're on the planning register, and I believe I actually emailed them to you in response to some concerns you'd raised about heights of buildings, and I emailed you the illustrative sections that we have here.
So are the public aware that the original planning application was submitted, and this is a revised planning application, of which the public inquiry is about the revised planning application, and the environmental impact assessment was based upon the original planning application, not the revised planning application?
A new site notice went up, the description of development was changed, the drawings were all annotated on the register as either superseded or updated. We held revised sessions at the parish hall. There was in-depth public advertising of those sessions. There have been briefings with numerous stakeholders, and we are sitting here today talking about the amended planning application.
Of January this year?
Correct.
And the environmental impact assessment was carried out on?
Has been updated, correct.
And with public consultation?
Yes, the public consultation was carried out.
Environmental impact assessment?
Yes, so the EIA was fully updated. It wasn't that there was an addendum made or any discrete changes to chapters. The entire environmental impact assessment was updated.
That's my understanding. Okay. Right. I've got a couple of quick questions for the Planning Authority, then we're going to move on to the townscape and visual impact. First, the Planning Authority, Ms. Johnson, you made the point about reserve matters and your professional view that landscape should not have been a reserve matter, it should have been part and parcel of the scheme. Now, back in England, a planning authority, when they receive an outline application and it then has a look at it and thinks, actually, we can't determine this without one of the reserve matters being included, they can actually formally require the applicant to include those details. Now, I think I know the answer, but I assume that provision doesn't exist in Jersey.
No, there's nothing which stipulates that. And I think the other thing I would note was that when I joined the authority, the application had been received, validated and consulted on. So to then require, yeah, it wasn't an option.
Okay. The next one was on height, so I think we've dealt with it. Yes, I was going to ask Ms. Ingle, in terms of what you were relaying in the concerns that you expressed, I suppose the sort of question I've got to ask you is, well, if you have formed those concerns and Jack have those concerns on the application as revised, what is it that the applicant would need to do to make those concerns go away? Or is that too big a question? Is that what I'm here for?
I think that is an extraordinarily large question, and one of the issues in planning is not to try and redesign things on the hoof or indeed in committee. This is what we've been presented with. Looking at the island plan, I'm of the opinion it doesn't meet the policy intent or the policy requirements, and therefore an objection arises, and it's not overcome by the suggestion that this is a place that can take higher buildings and has a limited sensitivity. I think that it's more nuanced than that.
I suppose what I'm getting to, and I'm not trying to lead you, is that concern one about it's just too much in terms of quantum and scale, that reining it back would address those issues. But I'm also conscious of Mr. Young this morning was reminding me of when he wrote the foreword to the SPG, and he does say, I forget the precise words, Mr. Young, but it's about difficult decisions will need to be made around all of those balancing issues.
Indeed. And that's one of the challenges of planning. It's very clear that this development in terms of providing new homes for the community in Jersey are required. It's very clear that providing a high quality landscape environment for that new community is very much a positive. But the cost, I would contend, is at the impact on, will come to views and heritage, but also the quantum, mass and scale of development in the context of St Helier, and specifically in the context of this as a new place. And that is the planning balance, and that is the challenge.
Okay. Is that a seamless transition into...
I just had one more. Sorry, I've just recapped my notes. I turned the page here.
Yep.
It was something which Mrs. Johnson said early on in her submissions, and it was about the question in the urban character appraisal about sensitivity to change, new waterfront. There's very interesting commentary on page 96 of the 2021 review. This is it's quite an engaging read, because the reviewers are walking around their character areas and appraising what has happened between the first document that they produced in 2005 and the position I would assume in at the end of. Have you got one?
Yep.
To update their thought process to the end of 2020, early 2021. And they provide a commentary here on page 96. And we touched on it this morning, but in there, it talks about the way the waterfront has evolved, the desire to deliver an attractive and engaging place. And this is where my reference was taken in the opening statement, but it does review in their opinion that the new waterfront sensitivity to change is now only low. I know elsewhere in the document it does talk about density and height, but this commentary on page 96 is clearly a broader statement than particularly referring to density or height.
Okay, thank you.
I thought it was an interesting read too. It was.
Most parts.
Okay. Right. Okay, well, does that then take us on to Townscape and Visual? And your...
There's no further comments from our team. Thank you.
Sorry?
Nothing further from our team.
No? No. Okay. Right, so how are we going to do this? This is Sarah Gibson.
I believe it is. She's been waiting patiently on Teams. If Delta could do their thing, please.
And is she going to put some images up?
She is not, but I believe George, who is another member of the Gillespie's team in an entirely different room, has the ability to put images up if we want to refer to anything in particular, but I will leave it for that to emerge, so we have access both to the material that's in the appendices to the ES and our expert witness who authored the TVIA. Over to Sarah, please.
Hello, can you, oh, I've got a lot of feedback. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hello?
I think they can hear you, Sarah, but
Okay.
they have to mute. They have to mute to avoid the feedback.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Patrick. Okay, good afternoon. Apologies for not being there today. I was on an afternoon flight yesterday. We tried to land twice and had to turn back to Manchester. And obviously the flight was cancelled, so I couldn't get there. My name's Sarah Gibson. I'm a landscape architect and I'm a fellow of the Landscape Institute. I have over 30 years experience at Gillespie's, where I am Director of Landscape Planning. For clarification, in response to Mr. McCarthy's statement from this morning, I have had no involvement in the Horizon development. My assessment, the TVIA, is based on the parameters plans and the design codes, which set out, as we've all been discussing, the overall ambition for the development. There is inevitably a degree of subjectivity when judging the magnitude and direction of effect, i.e. whether it's likely to be a positive change, negative change, or neutral change. So this means that all my decisions have been accompanied by text setting out a reasoned justification in each case. These can be found in full at Chapter 8 of the Environmental Statement and summarised in my proof of evidence. So I'll very quickly just go through the key summary of the TVIA. My TVIA acknowledges that during demolition and construction, there will be some significant adverse effects on townscape character and on views, both within the site and the eastern side of St Aubyn's Bay, including some localised effects on part of the protected coastal area due to the marine defence works. These effects will, however, be temporary and will vary over the construction period depending on the intensity and scale of the works at the time. In the longer term, I consider that there will be significant beneficial effects on townscape character. This is due partly to the appearance of the waterfront area at the moment, and also the combination of a more attractive, coherent and legible urban centre in the waterfront area and the new West Park Gateway along the edge of the bay. The park in particular will provide an attractive new coastal frontage, and the views and the relationship between St Aubyn's Bay, Elizabeth Castle and the coastline will be enhanced. The views of traffic, which currently sort of dominates the views from the beach and car parking, will be replaced by trees and the relocated La Frigate cafe above the new seawall and slipway. In the longer term, given the height and massing of the buildings in the waterfront area, the development will alter views, particularly those close to the area, but also some from further afield. Many of these changes will be beneficial and will be in the context of policies within the South West St Helier SPG. I do recognise, however, and I've been very clear on this, that there will be some specific circumstances that may give rise to adverse visual effects. This is because the presence of new buildings will affect or block views which are valued and susceptible to change. This includes views from Fort Regent, where some of the, as we will see, I'm sure I'll be questioned on this, but where some of the sea views and the lower parts of the coastline will be permanently obscured, as the development will block more of the sea and the beach, which is already been affected by the horizon development. There will also be significant adverse effects on views from the western approach to St Helier. This is because as you get closer to the buildings, they begin to obscure views of the fort. And it's probably around 500 metres away that the dome itself will be obscured, and I've identified that as an adverse effect. The other location where you might have some significant adverse effects is from parts of the town, such as St John's Road. So these currently have like a distant view of the sea, so or Elizabeth Castle just above the roofscape, and that some of those views could be obscured. So that just concludes my summary. I'm sure there will be questions as to why I've made certain decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wonder, would it be possible to show some of the images, sort of photo montage images, the verified views? I think that would be very helpful for particular members of the public here, just to understand the change. We did look at the digital model this morning, but that's fairly blocky and clunky.
I think Sarah, have to correct me if I'm wrong, I think the TVIA methodology uses the AVI images, which are the wireframes, which George has got on the screen here. They are not great viewing here, but I'm looking at the same, and we can zoom in on some of the elements of the drawing. So unless Sarah has a different view, I suggest it's the AVI images which are available here that which we can review.
Yeah. Completely agree. Sorry, I'm waiting for a gap. It's quite hard when you're not in the room to work out when there's a gap so we can speak. So this is the viewpoint 01, number 1, which is the view from Elizabeth Castle. So we have a before and after, where you can see that much of the development will actually be screened from view by Radisson and Horizon buildings. So it's just appearing on the skyline there.
George driving the slides. I wonder if we could just zoom in a bit on the elements of the scheme which are visible.
From the slipway to Elizabeth Castle, the distant view. So what we see in the foreground, that's the existing view, and the blue lines there are how it would change with the development, built at its maximum parameters.
Correct.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the change in view is not as substantial here as some from some other locations. I don't know if anybody wants to ask questions or whether we just move on to the next view.
Maybe that this becomes a bit more sort of round table. I know it's going to sort of drift into the heritage issues later, but obviously what we saw there, if you want to make any comment as we go through, please do. Okay, so where are we now?
So this is viewpoint number 3, which is from Westmount Road. So it's hard to see. I'm struggling a little bit on my screen, but there's a blue lines flashing up there. You can see that they don't break the skyline. They do obscure some of the lower part of Town Hill, but essentially the tree line remains visible. Obviously the dome still remains visible. And I don't think there's going to be a massive change in that view. It's a highly developed view. I think I've identified it as
Please, yeah.
mindfulness because of some of the a bit of the loss of the wooded ridge line, and some of the sea view will be lost there just to the right of the chimney.
Yeah.
The green building is horizon, I believe, so that's the crane for horizon. So the green is the outline of the unfinished at the time horizon buildings.
Yeah, anything in green is another development that's currently under construction or planned. So that's that one. The next one, if we move on to the next one, which is 3.5. This is from St Albin, quite a way away. Again, I think you're going to have to zoom in to see this. So this is another one where the view will change, but it's not going to take away much of the wooded backdrop. It will take a little bit of the backdrop away, but not much of it. So from a distance, it will be seen, and obviously it varies depending on the weather, time of day, etc. But it is quite far away, and again, I identified this as a fairly neutral change of minor magnitude, a minor significance. Just didn't think, yeah, I didn't think it changes too much from what's there. It's just different, slightly different buildings. Now the next one, I mean, if you want, I'll have to look it up because I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I can tell you how far away these are if you like. I just need to look them up in my more detailed assessment. So this is the view from Fort Regent, which you will all recognise. Now this is one where you can see on here how the horizon development has now broken that continuous view of the sea and the beach on the far side of the bay, and the proposed development will block more of it. So I have identified this as moderate adverse. This is one of the more challenging views in that respect.
Could I just ask and just double check the viewing point there is where exactly?
It's just by the wall. I don't know if you can't see it on there. On my printout, I've got the wall there, so it's just in front of the leisure centre.
At the top, is it's not on Pier Road? It's above that.
Yeah.
These were pre-agreed with the planning authority, and this is next to the pop-out of the lift core in front of the front door to Fort Regent.
Those killer steps, then.
Yeah.
I think those green buildings that are shown on there, that green outline, that's the IFC development, which is pretty well obscured from this view.
Sorry, thank you. Hi, Sarah, it's Wendy from the local authority. The categorisation of the adverse effect of moderate significance, why was it classified as moderate rather than major? If you could just explain that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I felt that it delivers more of the majority of that view is very urban. You know, it's not the most. I mean, I classified it as a high value view, not on the basis of its aesthetics, but on the basis of the fact that it's a popular viewpoint from a designated site. So, but I felt in terms of the magnitude of change, I didn't feel it should be classed as the scale of change is large. You still have sea views to the west. I mean, the one thing you don't realise, well, when we're looking at a snapshot like that, there's still an awful lot of sea to the left of the view that is still there. So I think it's not introducing anything completely new into that view. It's introducing more built development. It's the only adverse effect I could see is it's blocking part of the sea, and it's adding to what Horizon has already done. So I didn't think it merited major.
Thank you.
To say that virtually everything you see in that shot there wasn't there when Fort Regent was built.
Is classed as significant.
Okay. Have we got more?
We've got a lot more. Depends on how we want to pick out the key views. That
Yeah, we would certainly do this one.
So we have some of these viewpoints are from quite close to the development. Sorry, I'm getting feedback again. Close to development. This I classed as a low. When we do the assessment, I have to look at the value of the view and the susceptibility of the receptors, as well as the magnitude of change. And I would class this as not a particularly high value view. It's dominated by the road, and not particularly highly susceptible receptors. So people walking in this location are not necessarily walking there to admire the view, I wouldn't have thought. So this one I classed as minor beneficial, because I feel that the development of the whole will actually improve that outlook. That's my judgment anyway. I'm sure not everybody will agree with me, but I think that will improve the outlook slightly. Move on again. The next one is Marina Gardens, where we've now got that's one of the Horizon buildings to the left, isn't it? Yes. And again, I don't think it's a particularly high value view. It's a piece of albeit well used green space, but the Aqua Centre is not the highest level of architectural design, and I just feel that this will actually result in a moderate beneficial change from here. Assume it's all on the assumption that it's delivered to the high quality that the design codes aspire to. The next one is the junction of the Esplanade and Payne Street. We've just got the, I know I was going to say the IFC building, but can't see it in this view. Again, moderate, and I've said neutral because we're just introducing more urban buildings into a view that's not of particularly high quality at the moment. So I thought this was a moderate effect, probably neutral change. I don't think it changes the view that much. I mean, we only have to come a few meters to the back and you will see plenty more of these tall buildings. In fact, there's the green outline, that's the IFC, but you see the green outline there of the IFC building. Next one is from Mount Bingham. Yeah, you have to zoom in a bit there. Said this as non-significant effect, really, that it does obscure some of that the buildings along the Esplanade, but it's more development of the same type, which is more just extending or changing the view. So it won't be a particularly different view. Next one is from the Esplanade. Okay, so again, the value of this view I classed as low. It's dominated by the road. I classed the receptors as a medium susceptibility. I think it will be used by people walking to work. It's not people going there particularly to admire the view. And again, I thought this was a beneficial effect of moderate significance. There'll be the design of the streetscape and the new buildings will actually improve this outlook. The next one is La Rue de la Libération. Excuse my French. Again, low value. view, low susceptibility receptors, and moderate beneficial effect. I think this one overall will be an improvement to the view. The next one is the roundabout in front of the waterfront. And again, low value, low susceptibility, moderate beneficial. There'll obviously be a large scale of change to this view. But I think overall, if it's delivered to the design codes and that the quality that is set out in those, then that will be positive change. Next one is Castle Street, where at the moment you're just looking down between the buildings towards the waterfront centre. Here I've suggested, well, my judgment is minor beneficial. I think it will change the view a bit, but not substantially. The view is focused more on the buildings in the foreground and the midground. Again, a beneficial effect. Viewpoint 26. Again, might need to zoom in, please, on this one. I've said this will be, my judgment was minor adverse because there is some loss of the views of Town Hill and the walls. I mean, from that distance, it will be noticeable, but not prominent. I think the next viewpoint, though, by the time you get, so this next viewpoint is from approximately 440 metres away, so just under half a kilometre. From sort of it was from the Gateway Tower when we had the Gateway Tower. Now it's at this point we lose the dome. So you can see clearly here, we lose the dome, we lose Town Hill, we lose the views of the tree line on the horizon. So moderate adverse.
Another viewpoint that I wanted to clarify how we derived at moderate adverse rather than major adverse.
Sorry, just let me just look at the detail and susceptibility. They said high value, high susceptibility. I think it's similar to before. I mean, we've already got that. The view it's aesthetically not the greatest view. Yes, it's got Fort Regenton, and that's a historic site. It's got Loughborough-Gating, but it's adding more of what is already there. Again, the main issue here is it is blocking the view towards Fort Regent, which is starting to come onto heritage issues, really. And from a townscape point of view, yes, it's significant, and I've identified that significant and it's adverse, but I didn't think it was major, because I think if you took away the fact it's blocking Fort Regent, I don't think you would ever argue that was a major adverse effect. But this is a location where I've quite clearly said, I'm not trying to hide the fact, it is a significant adverse effect. I think to be major, it would have to be enormous industrial development. This will be a high quality development. And the final one is from St John's Road. This is just an illustration that from some locations on the higher ground where you've got a sea view, which obviously is very important to people, and we only take the views from ground levels. So I'm sure the people that live in these properties, when they're up on the third floor, see more of the sea. But those views from some locations will be blocked. So again, I've identified this as moderate adverse. But Horizon, I mean, again, the Horizon development is already screening some of that view. But the proposed development would add to it. Right, I think there are three areas where adverse effects will be experienced, and one is where you're blocking views of the dome itself. Two is where you're blocking views of the sea from these elevated areas, not from everywhere, because not everywhere can see the sea, obviously, but there are some locations where you can see above the roofscape of the town. And the third is moving along the promenade. When you get to about half a kilometre away, you start losing views of the dome. When you're up at Fort Regent, it blocks the views of the sea. I think from the heritage heritage specialist will perhaps regard it as a major effect, but from a purely visual, just looking at it as the aesthetics of the view, I thought those effects were moderate at first, not major.
Clarify one other point. Thank you for that. I noted from your proof of evidence, you'd referred to viewpoint 15 also having a moderate adverse impact, which is not one which has the wireframe analysis. What's the distance from, viewpoint 18 is from St Albans Bay Promenade looking towards the application site. What's the distance at that point?
130 metres approximately. The reason I identified this, that from that location, you would still see the dome of Fort Regent, but you would actually lose some of the walls of the fort again.
And what was the distance?
I'm sorry, 830 metres.
130 metres.
130, yeah, approximately.
All right, can we have the lights up then, please? Well.
Good afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so. Planning Authority, do you have any more questions on that evidence or?
No, thank you.
No. Anything the applicant's team wants to draw out from their own witnesses' submissions?
No, I think that was a very straightforward, honest presentation, and it's reflected in the submissions that we've made with the application as a whole, so.
Yeah, I mean, there's nowhere to hide with this sort of visual representation. They have to be done to that prescribed standard, and people will have very different views about the impacts, and and LVIA consultants will always accept that there is an element of subjectivity in them. But I've looked at all the views in the submissions and in physical sense as well. I've been to all of those viewpoints, various points. So I'll form a view, and I'm sure we're probably going to come back to it when we talk about heritage. But just before I wrap this session up, I'll just see if there's any questions on what we've heard. Mr. Young first.
Thank you, sir. I find it difficult to pose a question because obviously we heard an account there of using a certain technique, rating if you like, the damage to the views. I suppose if there is to be a question, what occurs to me is that all those ratings deal with every individual view as if it exists on its own, where it doesn't. What we saw there was about 26 different views from virtually all the sort of areas people are likely to see this from the west of the island. And for me, is there not, does this technique not recognise the cumulative assessment? There is no way you can go to escape this. If you live in the west of the island, you're going to see it from all those places. And in some places, it looks more horrible than others. I'm feeling quite emotional now because I think really my fear for Jersey, and anyway, I don't want to make a long speech, but is there no way that the cumulative assessment on what is a huge proportion of people in Jersey live in the western part of town? Fortunately, the eastern parts won't see it. On the other side of Fort Regent, it'll be all those from the west that do. Is there no recognition of the cumulative effect, given the fact that Jersey is such a small space and that the bowl of St Helier is so significant in sort of, it's an urban landscape, and it has real quality. I think it's got a character of its own. And when you fly in on an aircraft, for example, and you land towards the west, and you fly over and you look on the left-hand side of the aircraft when you're around about a few hundred feet high, you see the bowl of St Helier, and there you're going to see, I think, these prominent structures dominating the view. And so it's a question about the cumulative effect and, the, you know, rather than just focusing on individual. So I know maybe the technique doesn't represent that, but anyway, I have real concerns over that cumulative impact. And the question I ask is, well, if those buildings weren't of that mass and that scale, could this be moderated and mitigated? And that's a question, I suppose, for those that are going to have to handle the downstream planning applications and whether or not we can have faith in a system of parameters which are not part of an application. Or at least, sorry, design codes, etc. Anyway, sir, I've made my point.
I've got three points to raise in response to that. I think, first of all, the application responds, in our view, to a clearly articulated policy position, which is embedded in, first of all, the island plan through the commentary that is taken forward from the urban character appraisal. It is embedded in the outputs from the St Helier planning framework, which is again referenced several points within the island plan, which endeavours to deliver that framework. And I think the third point is that the images are put together in a really, really useful way. They've disappeared from the screen, but the view from Fort Region, for example, shows us the consented buildings. It shows us the buildings which are under construction, the buildings which are finished. That does set a tide line. It throws a blanket over that part of town, and the proposal responds to the context which is set by the history of determinations across the waterfront estate, from IFC to the Radisson to Horizon, all the way across to Castle Quay. It's my view there is nothing new, unexpected, or dramatically different about scale than has been experienced throughout the history of planning applications on the reclaimed land of the waterfront. And that is exactly what is embedded in the policy documents that we've all been referring to. Even if height is moderated and reduced, those drawings are done so that the kind of nominal break in floor heights is a horizontal line on all the images. And even if you start taking floors off these buildings, going back to that view from Fort Region, the existing cinema breaches the foreshore. It removes the view of the foreshore from Fort Region. The replacement buildings would be 2 floors high. Is that delivering the wider objectives that the island plan gives, puts at the top of its list of community expectations? We are failing to deliver, if we take that approach, against a whole suite of other policies in terms of optimising development densities so that we actually deliver new homes on the most sustainable sites, because those homes will need to be delivered somewhere else. And it isn't this simple, but I've been in many, many planning committees where applicants and objectors just talk about if they're not delivered here, it will be greenfield land in the next island plan review that will be lost to meet the housing needs of the island. It isn't that binary, but that is part of the assessment, and that is part of the spatial strategy which the plan seeks to deliver through the objective of optimising the delivery of new homes and development opportunities on the most sustainable brownfield sites. There's an opportunity cost to removing floors, and it is incidental in relation to visual impacts across the area, given the range of buildings that are already built down there.
So I accept the argument, the logical argument about choice with homes or landscape. Accept that.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions on the landscape and visual evidence.
Thank you. There's an area that appears to be neglected, which are the people who live along the esplanade. And had we seen a picture of, say, from the third floor of Marina Court or the block of flats next to it, I think you'd have seen a ghastly sight for those people. And I think those areas need to be taken into account. It's the first thing I'd like to put to the Development Committee. And the second thing is that all the emphasis appears to be on how it looks from Port Regent and coming from the east. You hardly see the waterfront coming in that direction. The direction that everybody will be and does complain about is coming from the west. Because as you come along St Auburn, from St Auburn, you see it for about 10 minutes. And I believe most people who see it are ashamed of what they see in terms of the development. And that needs to be the one thing that I believe the inspector should take into account, is the visual impact of those. Having seen it, that's the first time I've seen that drawing. And I heard the gasp from a few people who saw it, because it looked horrific to an islander to see the size of that close up. When you're coming past where the cinemas are, it's just going to be so overbearing. And I really believe that the argument should be exactly the argument that we used about citing the hospital in Gloucester Street with a high building there, that is inappropriate in its size. And I believe that John Young was absolutely right when he was calling for things to be reduced. Yes, there has to be housing there. It's important, but that's no reason to overdo that area. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Barbart. Okay, Mr. McCarthy, your question? We are already into the heritage hour, so if you could be...
You don't say that. Okay. I would... the lady's on that was earlier. She made a statement that I said that she worked on the horizon. I didn't.
She said she did not.
I didn't. Yeah, but she said she didn't, and I didn't say she did.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. It's important. Who did, though, was WSP. Is that correct? They're the civil ones.
I don't think we're here to discuss that.
No, but that's fine. They are, anyway. And they were responsible for preparing the scoping document in 21. They prepared the scoping document. And they submitted it. There was no response, so they have progressed with this visual impact assessment with no agreement on from where you take the photograph and to what.
That's incorrect, Mr. McCarthy. It was clear agreement with the planning authority. Views
is this right that you could interrupt me? I mean,
well, it's a correction.
No, but it's well, I don't interrupt.
Well, you
finished my time.
You finish your point.
Sorry, I've been interrupted. So I'm saying that the planning department and all the consultees, which includes the English Jersey Heritage, etc., and members of the public, which have been mentioned, they need to participate in from where you take the view and in what direction. And the visual impact assessment covers many things. One is obviously what's this object look like in the landscape, but what's the view of Victoria College next to this huge monstrosity? What is the view from Victoria College down the historical view towards the sea? And that's not been done. And so the flaw here is that, of course, Jersey is a beautiful island of outstanding natural beauty, but it is also responsible as the caretaker of heritage sites of international importance for present and future generations. And therefore, we're not talking about some industrial estate or nobody cares about. This is the most sensitive views in the world. And it should be taken that seriously. And therefore, a scoping that involves the public or the consultees that they then agree from where the views are taken and in what direction. And at the moment, that has not been done. Therefore, the whole of course, it's easy. I will take views looking down a little narrow street, and you just see a glimpse of the building. We would have never accepted that as our selected views. So this is what I'm trying to get across. The presentation, however good it was, does not, sorry. Is it, there are two meetings going on. Sorry. Anyway, that's what I want to say. And until that's done, the public, this document that's been pulled together by Watermans is the non-executive summary produced for the public. And that opening statement says the scoping document was prepared by Watermans, who are also the consultants for the neighbouring site as consulting engineers.
Okay.
Paid for by the same client.
Okay, thank you. Right. I was going to draw a line there on that session, and I'm sure we're going to pick up the same. Sorry, there's something to say?
I was just going to clarify in terms of the viewpoints that were included in the environmental impact assessment. They had been agreed with the local authority, with the head of development and land at the time.
Okay.
We also have the 3D model available for anyone to choose any view they like around that bowl of St Helier.
Yes. Okay.
There's a physical model.
Right. Let's take a 5-minute comfort break. I think it is just 5 minutes because of pressure of time. And then we'll move on to heritage. And these issues are going to come again because we're going to talk about setting impacts on some of these heritage assets. Okay. Take 5. Right. Last session of the day, which is a bit more time constrained than I'd hoped. This is going to cover the historic environment, and on the programme we've got 3 items listed: archaeology, listed buildings and structures within the site, and then the third item is impacts on settings of listed buildings in places outside of the site. I believe we are going to hear from Mr. Farman.
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
For the applicant, and we have Ms. Ingle for the authority, and there may be others that wish to come in. I'll perhaps just cut through this. We'll try and shortcut it a little bit.
Yep.
In terms of my having read your proof, Mr. Farman, and Ms. Ingle's submissions, and the heritage assessment. It feels to me that of that, well, the first issue of archaeology, that's effectively scoped out because the site's effectively made ground.
Yeah, that's agreed. Yeah.
I just wanted to check on that. Are there any sort of, I just wondered whether there's any sort of peripheral issues, around the area of the Esplanade Wall when, if those works were to be consented by the Minister, is there a need for any archaeological watching brief or whatever while that work is carried out, or is it all above ground?
In the past, the wall has been removed and an archaeological watching brief has been conditioned as part of the International Finance Centre works. So if this were to be moved to approval, adding that watching brief would be helpful.
Okay, but it would just be that particular area, is it? There's no other areas of...
No, the only other area I can think of is the unlisted components of the former seawall that would be lost as part of the development. That may benefit from a watching brief, but it's hard to ask for that because it's not a designated asset.
Right, okay. So that's archaeology. And then just in terms of my hopefully shortcut of the issue, in terms of listed buildings and structures within the site, as I'm reading it, we've obviously got, I think we've got 3 heritage assets to consider. The Grade 2 listed casemate, which would be physically retained, but its setting would be rather changed, wouldn't it? It would no longer be on the seafront, it would be within a sort of sunken area. It comes across actually quite well on the model. If anybody's interested, you can actually see the thinking around that. So there is that heritage asset, the casemate. Then we've got the promenade that we just discussed, which would involve the loss of, I think it's about 6 metres, isn't it?
Yes.
And then we have the cafe, the Grade 2 listed cafe, which sure we can have a discussion on. So those are the 3 on-site heritage assets, and then we need to look at the effect on settings of listed buildings in the wider area, some of which we've touched on earlier in terms of Fort Regent, Elizabeth Castle, and there's a few more listed places as well, Westbank Gardens, People's Park, Victoria Park. And I think, Ms. Ingle, you make the point about the wider setting of the St Helier Bowl, as you call it in your... So that's what we kind of need to skip through. So, Mr. Farman, over to you then to... you can skip archaeology completely and just move on to, if you could give me your views on the heritage assets within the site.
Thank you. Hopefully the HIA that I wrote is clear and sets out my findings. I'm very familiar with the site, going through it and to and past it twice a day. I live at St Albans, so I'm well aware of all the townscape views and impacts, the views as you move along from the west of the island to the east. And I have 25 years experience here in Jersey working with listed buildings and their settings. In terms of the on-site listing assets, you've noted there's 3. That's correct. There was 2 when the project began, and then La Frégate was listed by the Government of Jersey halfway through the process. The Esplanade Promenade is a stretch of the seawall that was truncated by La Rue de Liberation, so the 4 to 6 lane highway that splits the site, truncated that wall, and you can see that the wall has been curved to accommodate parts of the new development. The wall to the east of that road, except for the final nib of that wall, is the listed part, is the listed building. And at the moment, at the far east end, you have the IFC development, and that's where the seawall abuts Castle Street. And the IFC development has, in my opinion, quite successfully interpreted the setting of the former seawall and retained its character and has produced a good area of public open space, which is quite pleasant to be within. Obviously, the setting of the seawall has fundamentally changed in the 1980s, 1990s by the reclamation of the land, so it's no longer acting as a seawall. As you move further along the listed promenade, the site to the south becomes a building site and then moves on to being a large public car park. And the land to the north turns into a motorcycle car park. To me, it's a poor setting for that listed building, and it can be improved. And my ultimate findings for the impact on this listed building is that its setting would be enhanced by the proposal. There is a requirement to form public access from the town onto the waterfront area. That is facilitated by forming a gap in the listed seawall. That initially was much wider than is now currently proposed, and I think the Heritage Environment team were correct in pointing out that that change to the fabric of the listed building could be limited to a greater degree, and that is indeed what the design team achieved by minimising the gap down to 6 metres. In discussions with myself, it was decided that any masonry arising, any historic fabric arising, should be reused to actually close an existing car park opening, which is further west, to enable just pedestrian access. So that historic fabric won't be lost from the site and will be reused to contribute to the repair of another section of the promenade. So I mentioned before that the actual reason for the seawall has long since disappeared because the land is being reclaimed. The Esplanade was built as a piece, the Esplanade Promenade seawall was built as a piece of land reclamation itself. And that allowed the town to expand further south, enabling warehousing and hotels and other commercial operations historically to populate that area. Most of those historic buildings have themselves been demolished. The only listed buildings within the vicinity of the Esplanade Promenade and Sea Wall is the remnants of 2 granite warehouses, which are 2 doors down from Castle Street, and they have had installed behind them a 6-storey office block. There's a couple of other 19th century buildings still surviving along that road, but they're not listed. So the remainder of that northern side of the Esplanade is modern development of various architectural styles of differing architectural quality, I would say. Some of the more recent additions are, I believe, an enhancement compared to the previous attempts to develop that stretch of St Helier. So the historic context for that wall has changed fundamentally. Both sides of the actual listed building itself. On one side, we have a land reclamation, which is now IFC, the road, La Rue de Liberation, and the rest of the waterfront. and on the other side we have this motorcycle park and a largely redeveloped esplanade frontage. As I said, in my view, the conclusion to reach in terms of the impact on this listed building is that the change can be accommodated and actually its setting would be enhanced.
Okay, if I could stop you at that point on the Esplanade, because I don't want to go through them all and then come back.
Yep.
And I'm going to bring Ms. Ingle in. I've got your proof in front of me, and you conclude on this point under impacts at 8.11 of your proof. You say there is a loss of historic fabric to the Esplanade promenade and unlisted parts of the wall that have strong townscape and cultural value. There'll be a significant impact on setting from adjacent new high buildings to the south, which has already been evidenced in the losses associated with the current IFC. Further breaches in the seawall are regrettable but have been minimised with past breaches sealed with reused materials. I'm not sure, does that mean you object, or do you agree with Mr. Farman's assessment?
I agree insofar as reusing existing materials is a positive, it's recycling. The opening is required to link this new development to the town. The setting impacts, I suspect we might slightly disagree on, in that Mr. Farnham believes that the changes will be an improvement because the current setting is poor. My suggestion is that it will be improved through landscape improvements, but actually there will be an impact through the imposition of further tall buildings adjacent to it.
But you don't dispute the fact that that link is necessary?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And welcome the reduction from the original, I think it was 12 metres, to the current 6.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Let's do the same process then for the casemate. Mr. Farman?
Thank you. Yeah, the listing for the casemate is reasonable, and the reason for its listing is reasonable also. The actual outline of the listed building is incorrect in my view because it also includes an extension to the rear which dates from 1973 or 74, which is the public toilets, which aren't of any historic or architectural interest. This building is something that myself and the designers talked about at length. There's a public requirement for works to the foreshore here to create the bund. This is to do with flood alleviation, which I understand you'll be picking up later in the week as a separate topic. Given that those works are a requirement, my approach was to try and manage the change as sensitively and as successfully as possible. Out of those discussions came a clear commitment to demolish the modern extensions that affect the listed building, to create the well that you mentioned earlier in front of the casemate, to provide public amenity space and potentially entertainment or arts area, and to provide the casemate with a positive long-term use. So at the moment it's used informally for storage and part of one of its lower rooms is flooded. So the building needs to have a use going forward to warrant its upkeep and protection, and the design codes, which I know have been mentioned at length this morning, provide guarantee of positive use for the building. The issue with the frontage of the listed buildings, there's agreement between myself and the heritage officer that actually building in front of the casemate does disrupt its setting, and that is an important part of its setting. So the idea is to minimise that impact by leaving the entire frontage of the casemate exposed. So all of the granite cobbles, which are reused from slipways by the German occupying forces, all of that becomes on show. The gun embrasure remains on show, and actually, as a member of the public, it would actually be easier to engage with that frontage of the listed building than it is presently the case, albeit in a different setting. So I felt it was important, certainly, that that frontage remained clear and unobstructed insofar as its entire frontage could be seen and experienced. And that was a positive way of managing that change to an important part of its setting. The remainder of the discussion revolved around, given that we have to provide the bund and the change to the frontage setting, what else can we do for this building? And that's where the other interventions in terms of removing the later extensions, the improvements to the landscaping, providing the positive use for the building came to the fore. And I'm pleased that the applicant has taken on board those challenges and put them in the application. My overall assessment is there is some harm to the frontage. That is mitigated as much as possible, and there's some distinct benefits to the rest of the building in terms of its setting and its use.
Okay, Ms Hinkle, just turning to you. I mean, I suppose if you start from the position that the coastal defence is in the public interest and notwithstanding everything else, if that were to go ahead, what Mr Farman set out is that a pretty decent approach to the asset?
I agree, in as much as finding a new use for that building is positive. Re-exposing the frontage and removing the modern buildings, again, is a positive. And re-engaging that with the public is, again, a positive. From a pure heritage point of view, the best outcome would be to retain the relationship with the sea, but clearly that can't be achieved given the requirements for flood alleviation. So I think that's as far as the applicant could go, but nonetheless, I still believe there is a damaging impact on the setting of that listed building, notwithstanding the mitigations that have occurred.
I don't think, Mr Farman, you disagree, do you?
No,
there is harm.
HIA is quite clear, and we've just simply sought to mitigate that as far as possible.
Yes, there's clearly an important part of its setting is that connection with the sea. And if you put the coastal defence in, that's lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Got to get you to argue about something.
Don't you worry, it's coming.
Let's move on. Let's talk about the cafe building. Recently listed, I'm sure there's a story behind that, but let's go through the same process then. Mr Farman.
Thank you. Well, a similar story to the casemate in that the part of the site La Frégate occupies is affected by the works for the flood alleviation measures. This is an interesting building. I think I must be getting old if they're listing buildings that were constructed in my time, but it's a building which draws different reactions from different members of the public. Many people just don't care about it. Other people think it's wonderful for various reasons. It's got a clear association with an important architect, and the original scheme did not include its retention. Once the government of Jersey listed the building, the applicant sought a way to retain it. And the solution that has been found allies very closely to the listing schedule, which recognises that part of the architectural intent, as described by the former business partner of the architect, was that this was a stranded arc, and actually its location is not critical to its importance. My assessment of that is that provided this cafe has a seaside location, as it has now and would do in the proposal, that that its design intent is fulfilled. It's still a seaside cafe. So I was delighted to hear that this cafe would be relocated 200 metres and reused by Jersey Heritage as actually their gateway to Elizabeth Castle. And I thought this was an excellent choice of a new use where the building actually gets placed within the hands of the government's own heritage body. The applicants did do a little bit of work around the listed building prior to it becoming, prior to it going through the listing process. They undertook various studies about the building. It is in need of some repairs. It is in need of some upgrade. So some works to its fabric would take place regardless of whether it was kept in the same location or moved as proposed. The architectural importance of the building is generally its external form and its internal spaces. The conclusion that the applicants, structural engineers, have come to that the building can be prized up and moved is one that is a legitimate way to deal with this listed building, given that, again, the land has to be changed in order for flood alleviation. So I'm satisfied that the new position and the new use for this building is positive.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Ms. Ingle now. I think Mr. Mason might have something to say in a moment. No, we'll have Tracy first. So please.
Thank you. I agree again with most of what has been said there. If this were not a modern building, it would be an entirely different conversation. Mm-hmm. But this is a new manifestation, and its response is to reclaimed land. So one can make the argument moving it onto another part of the reclaimed land and finding a future use for it is a positive outcome. I'm less worried by the fact it needs some work doing to it, because every listed building in Jersey needs work doing to it. I think for me the issue will be the recreation of the architect's original intention in terms of groundscape and landscape, because this stranded arc was actually set into a bowl of gravel, concrete, a concave gravel apron, which has subsequently been overdrawn with decking to meet the cafe use. So I think it's going to take a very careful assessment of how best to relocate this into a new setting. And in addition to that, the Island Plan preamble allows for moving of historic buildings or listed buildings. I think there would need to be a significant amount of work to prove that this is a practical move. I note there's an engineering opinion, but I think there needs to be more work to prove this is actually practically attainable without damaging the building.
Okay.
So you're probably aware, but the structural assessment is the Waterman's document, Waterman Structures, and it's titled Structural Assessment. So it's all there in terms of their initial assessment, in terms of whether it's feasible to undertake this work. Mm. The design codes also set out that the actual current setting of the building, the bowl, the landscaping, would be recreated.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm just thinking about what I'm reporting to the Minister. Mm-hmm. Certainly in terms of the applicant and the planning authority, I'm not sensing huge disagreement in your approach, but I think, Ms. Ingle, you are saying more work is required to demonstrate the practicalities of the relocation.
Indeed, we have a feasibility opinion from a structural engineer, which I absolutely respect, but I know that moving a building that's constructed in the way that building's constructed will be a challenging movement to make.
Okay. I wanted to ask you both about the condition report, because given this building is not very old, it didn't make particularly good reading. There seemed to be quite a few issues with the building.
Yes.
Well, there's various works laid out. Some of it was about upgrading of facilities and mechanical issues. clearly the cladding has suffered. It is a very exposed location.
Very harsh location.
And I can't tell you what the government have been doing with the property over the years, but unless it's maintained on a regular basis, it will be an issue that reoccurs.
And if I might add, one of the problems is that a well-intentioned intervention into the cladding has been to paint it. And that has created some of the problems because I believe it was supposed to be left as a timber, naturally weathered.
To naturally
cladding.
weather.
Yeah.
So that's created pockets of dampness which in turn have been exacerbated by some inappropriate flashing details, which I suspect are a later manifestation of some of the changes of the building as it moves into its cafe use. So fundamentally, I think the building is sound, but there are certain areas where it will require further works.
Okay. Right, let's, Mr. Mason.
Just can't believe what I'm hearing. It's ridiculous. Why don't they talk to the architect? Okay. Go back to 1988, the island plan. The Albert Pier stretched all the way to First Tower. And in a moment of kind of madness, they built that waterfront wall. Do you know why? Because there was an alternative scheme at La Collette, which went into the planners, never been processed. Unlike the way this, call it phase 2.
I don't want to quote policy chapter and verse, but I just want to refer to two in particular. Policy GD9, which is Strategic Views and Vistas, and Policy HE1.
Sorry, the first one was?
GD9.
GD9.
Yes, Skyline Views and Vistas.
Yeah.
And I think I just use that to pick up some of the themes that were raised under the townscape, and as suggested by Ms Gibbons, that the views on impact from a landscape architecture point of view may be different from a heritage point of view. So to pick up that particular point, and that GD9 requires that Skyline's strategic views and the setting of listed buildings, places and key art must be protected and enhanced, and that any adverse impacts on such views, vistas and settings by way of siting scale, profile or design will not be supported unless the overall benefit to community are demonstrably outweighing those impacts. And in thinking about how those views may be impacted, they can be by obscuring in part or whole important views or vistas, or by detracting from the quality of a landscape, seascape, townscape setting, or the setting of a landmark building that comprises all or part of an important skyline view and vista. So the impact of the editing out and blocking the view from Fort Regent in particular to the sea in heritage terms, I believe is more than moderate. And in fact, it was interesting to note that anything major rather than moderate would have to be an industrial development. So it suggests that moderate has quite a high level of impact. Policy HE1 also specifically refers to setting, which I will not go into any more detail because that's in both our proof of evidence. So thinking about the two major landmark listed buildings in the vicinity or the setting of this site, you have Fort Regent that sits on the town hill, Monteville, and Elizabeth Castle that sits originally in isolation in St Albans Bay. The impact on Fort Regent, I think, will be significant and objectionable, and that is because of both the views from the fort and the views back to the fort that will not be edited, but in fact blocked. And I'm not persuaded in the same way that the fact that Horizon Development edits that is sufficient to allow, I think it was referred to as a blanket approach of modern development in that area. The views from Elizabeth Castle, we saw a view from the slipway, but of course, in thinking about views to and from historic buildings, they are dynamic. So the views from the gun emplacements at the top of the castle would be slightly different and, in my view, more significant than those from the slipway. There is also the view back to Elizabeth Castle, which I think will be undermined by the proposed new coastal defence works as they move further southwards and start to denude the separate quality of Elizabeth Castle in the bay. So I think the taller buildings and that western frontage will have an impact on setting. I recognise that the park will mitigate that to a degree by some form of screening, but the wall itself at 11 metres will go 250 metres closer to the castle and will, in my view, have a significant impact on the tranquility and some of the intangible assets of the setting. In terms of the setting of the town itself, I'm aware that the applicant's HIS refers to the town as an ensemble of buildings, and I absolutely understand that doing a setting impact of each building would be extremely challenging, time-consuming, and potentially not reveal much more than can be done in that same way. However, I reach a different view. I don't think the impact is minor. I think the impact is significant, and I'm thinking in particular of the parks, Westmount, People's Park, Parade Gardens, Victoria Park, and I'm also thinking of Pearson Road and how that's perceived in Western views with the backdrop of this new development. You can't see the waterfront from the town centre itself, but you do get views down the streets from the town centre through to the new development. And there will be quite a major change in the truncation of those views with new, tall, modern buildings, which will have an impact on listed buildings such as, for example, the Opera House at Grade 2. Thinking about buildings on the bowl, on the edge of St Helier, these are more distant impacts, but in setting it's a dynamic and cumulative set of impacts. So we've seen the view from St John's Road, which will again change matters. The view from Armora Crescent, I think, will be significant. Victoria Crescent will be significant changes to the views where the quantum, mass and scale of new development on the waterfront will be an imposition in the context and wider setting. And then finally, there's those views as one moves from the west towards St Helier. There is St Albans, there is the harbour, and there is the fort, St Albans Fort. Those are 850 to 1,000 metres away, and therefore one could argue the wireframe pop-up in blue was, you had to really zoom into it. But actually in that dynamic moving through those spaces and places, the change in the mass and scale of the edge of St Helier on the western approaches will have an impact. And I still hold, again, I do respect and understand that Noirmont Point is some distance away, but part of its intangible significance is the fact it's memorial to the community during the occupation of the island. And therefore, we need to think carefully about those wider impacts on those views.
Okay, just before I go back to Mr. Farman, I'll just test you a little bit on this. I just want to understand whether this is about deep-rooted principle of heritage and townscape impact, or whether it's very specific to this outline application. Because we heard at the beginning of the day, I think it was Mr. Nicholson talking about, or maybe the planning authority talking about considering the plan as a whole. Mm-hmm. And of course, this development is fairly well trailed by SPG, mm-hmm. And that SPG identifies opportunity areas. It's also fairly well informed by a pretty recent urban character appraisal review, 2021, which talks of 8-storey development in this area. So to put all those things together, the notion of large and tall building development here is, as I say, pretty well trailed. And isn't that inevitably going to have the effects on Elizabeth Castle and Fort Regent and views from St Albans that you articulate?
I think it's the issue of mass as well as height. So the South West St Helier urban character appraisal indicated that height would have an impact on both townscape and on listed buildings, as was read out earlier. And the quantum of development on this site is such that it is across the whole of the site. It is not the same as perhaps has happened in the past, where there have been blocks of buildings that have been added on the edge and then development set behind, where you've had a landmark building of the horizon. This parameter plan approach would allow for up to 8+ stories, and I'll leave the question of heights and stories to one side, but across the whole site. I respect and understand that architecturally and urban design, those have been fragmented to a degree and have been stepped down on parts of the site and raised on other parts of the site. I suspect that the St Helier character appraisal did not envisage a complete covering of the waterfront character area with buildings at 8 stories. I suspect there was a suggestion that it needed to push and pull more in terms of context. So in terms of setting, it is the quantum of those western approach buildings at that height, at that width, at that bulk, in the context of St Helier, that has the setting impact.
Okay, let me just explore that just a little bit further, and then I'll let the applicants come in. So if we take the Fort Regent view, and your concern is, well, if we were on the digital model, if you toggle on and off, when you toggle the proposal on, you lose that great big chunk of sea that you see in the view.
Yeah.
And we heard the applicant's landscape consultant saying that she didn't think that was major adverse. You think it is, but from what you were saying there, would your concern be addressed by a different proposal where you were in that viewpoint and you would see gaps between the buildings and you'd get glimpses of sea? Is that where you were heading?
I suspect is less about glimpses of sea. So if I go back to the planning framework for South West St Helier, the community expectation set out within that document is the relationship between the town and major landmarks and the sea. And therefore, I think it would need to channel views and have a significant reduction. So I don't think it's a matter of taking 2 commercial floors, for example, off the leisure building. It may well be a significant re-evaluation of the quantum of development. Hence my slightly hedging your earlier direct question about what should happen.
Yes, I understand, but you can understand me asking it. I hope.
Sorry?
I hope you can understand why I ask these
No,
questions.
absolutely.
Okay. Let me turn to the applicants team. You've heard a lot there from Ms. Ingle about setting impacts from Fort Regent, Elizabeth Castle, other locations, and the bowl of St Helier. And I took it out of order, but I wanted to sort of test her out on that point about, well, what actually is it? And she gave a very clear answer. It is not just about the height, but effectively the density, the mass of the whole thing. So over to you. Tell me what I should think.
Well, there was a number of comments from Ms. Ingle about specific buildings, etc., which I can run through if you wish. I might start with that if I could. The Opera House was mentioned, which is on Gloucester Street.
On Gloucester Street.
Yeah. So that is opposite General Hospital, which where you know the site there. I have to say, I had not evaluated that as being adversely affected by the proposal. The Opera House sits within modern development, It's very much part of one side of the street and doesn't have I don't believe the development much further down past the Esplanade would have any negative impact on its setting or the way it is perceived or enjoyed. Similarly, Victoria Crescent was mentioned. Don't know if you know that site, sir. Oh, you do. Okay, so that's the slightly later Crescent, which sits below Almora Crescent.
Yep.
That does have views towards that part of town. There's actually a very mature bank of trees, landscaping trees, which runs around its gardens and is in front of the buildings. So many of the views that you might expect from the list of buildings are actually blocked by its own landscaping. But that side, I haven't been into every one of those apartments to be able to comment further on that. You, in your questioning, I think you were picking up on the point about the alliance between the SPGs and the different height contexts and the Bridge Island Plan policies and what they're driving towards. Ms. Ingle mentioned that they didn't envisage 8 stories across the entire site. I don't think that's an entirely accurate reflection of what is proposed anyway. There are large areas of open space proposed and a good deal of variation in the building heights as well. I suppose that the key point I had in looking at the heritage impacts was what is there now on the site. And I know this environment very well. I see this view across Snowdons Bay, across Snowdons Fort, across Elizabeth Castle, travelling west to east across the island. Standing at that centre side of the island, you have Elizabeth Castle somewhat further to the south. Behind it and its L'Hermitage is an industrial site where waste is being processed up to, I'm sure John can tell me, but however metre tall, high the piles of waste are at the moment, and with no prospect of them being reduced as far as I can see. Next to that is the gas importation quay, and then some commercial buildings. Behind that is sat a power station and a chimney and an energy from waste plant. They all sit within that context, and it's really unfortunate, but they all sit within that context when viewed from the west. When viewed from the west over Elizabeth Castle, that's the setting behind. And then as you move further north, you get into the historic harbours and into the new waterfront development. And the quality of the buildings enhances along that part of the site. And that starts to create a more complete and a more successful urban edge. If I'm standing on Elizabeth Castle, my view is of an industrial site, moving through to the historic harbours, moving through to the modern harbours and the waterfront. It is my view that adding another building that continues on from the Radisson Hotel, carries on. In that view from Fort Regent, the building will carry on creating an urban edge. I think as a principle, that is an acceptable relationship with Elizabeth Castle. I think it could be very successful with high-quality buildings. I actually think having no building there accentuates the height of the Radisson Hotel when you view it from the west. So actually some sort of infill there would actually help in that regard. And I believe that the next Parkside building is set far enough away to actually not challenge the setting of Elizabeth Castle. Ms. Ingle made an important point about the foreshore moving forward and the 11 high metre wall. I think that's a reasonable point to make. And again, using Elizabeth Castle as your standing and viewing point, you'll see various ways at which the reclaimed land has been finished, that edge has been created. Although there is variation, they create a very strong urban edge. And I think, yes, it will be somewhat closer, but it will be a continuation of that strong urban edge. different engineering solutions are happening at the moment. There will be a change in appearance, but it won't be substantially different, such that it would harm the setting of Elizabeth Castle. The question of impacts from the west and how this mass and scale of development is seen within St Helier and within the wider setting of Fort Regent. When arriving at the west, you have a 10-storey building in Marina Court one side, you have an 11-storey building the other side of your view, the Horizon development. In between, there's the International Finance Centre, dual carriageway, and various other buildings in between. From longer distances, and it is dynamic, it just changes as you move along, you can see the flank edges of the cinema building, and you can see the flank edges of the office blocks along the esplanade. These are not good components of an urban setting for the castle. So I have drawn the conclusion that whilst the mass and the scale of these buildings will cause some interruption of views, the creation of a good urban edge to the town of St Helier justifies that. And that is, broadly speaking, why the impact on the town of St Helier is acceptable. Similarly, the impact from Normal, I mean, Normal Point, the German battery and the area of remembrance there, it's so much on the periphery of that listed site that I cannot judge that it would cause any adverse impact. From the other direction, from Fort Regent, I think you mentioned the point before, actually, about how much of those buildings were there when the fort was actually constructed. Even most of the historic harbours that you can see were not constructed when the fort was built. So everything else you see is modern reclamation and modern building works. And I aligned closely with the TVIA comments in respect of the impact on Fort Regent. And Fort Regent is enjoyed from within the building, from its different ramparts, from different spaces. Many of the views will simply be unaffected, and many of the ways that you experience the building will be unaffected by any development on the waterfront. In my statement case, I drew you to an appeal hearing, which tried to clarify, I think, how to deal with this issue of setting. And that was a Pine Grove appeal. And the inspector in that case of policy HU1 states that it is the special interest of a listed building or setting that must be protected, not the setting per se. My view on this is that setting can have an impact or can contribute to the significance of a building. But what the inspector is indicating there is that it's not the setting per se that is listed and has to be protected. I think it's worth just drawing that point out because there's always some debate over what is setting and what should be protected.
Okay. Right.
I've tried to cover that all in the HIA. Many views have been considered and talked about in the HIA. So if there's anything in particular in the HIA, any questions that on particular views.
Nothing further from me. I'll just go to the planning authority and we'll go.
Yeah, thank you for that. I said we'd get to a point we'd disagree, and I think we have, and so rather than go over each point, I'm aware of time passing. I do take the point about the Pine Grove case, but I would also suggest that the Bridging Island plan supersedes that case, and setting is specifically set out within the island plan, and HE1 then covers how we deal with setting. Setting is not a significance in its own right, because that comes down to a listed building, but it does contribute to significance. And I think the variation in interpretation is how much of that has an impact in terms of the development and its impact on the setting of listed buildings.
Okay, well, that's been a useful session between you two. I've understood your agreement, I've understood your disagreements, and they're all clear to me. So I'm going to go to the gallery. Questions on what you've just heard about heritage, if you have any. We've got Mr. McCarthy, and Mr. McCarthy, Mr. Viver, do you want to?
But I just wish to make actually just one point, and it's a total disagreement with what we've just heard about the impact of this all. It's all very well to be talking about coming into St Helier if you come in by car, for instance. You still see this building, you still see this massive buildings. And the idea that because the power station is there and because the heap of rubble is at the background, that somehow takes your mind away from the buildings, simply doesn't hold water. Because when you're coming into St Helier, and I travel in on the bus on the inner road, and when I get to King George V Homes, on that straight down to West Park Pavilion, all I can see is the waterfront. And all we will see as people of Jersey is what's going to happen there. And I really do think it's important, and I'm sure you, sir, will see it yourself when you come in from the airport. I don't have to remind you of it, that that's the dominant feature as you come into St Helier. And I think it's probably one of the most important issues that's going to be raised, is to what is it all going to look like? And I suspect any visitor arriving to Jersey, driving down there, seeing it all, will say, I thought there was a planning committee here that wouldn't have allowed that. And I really do think it's something that you should make a high priority, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. Okay, Mr. McCarthy, your heritage question.
Is it okay just to, from the non-executive EIA for public consultation, is it possible?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
To get this picture up?
Yeah, the case, mate, yeah.
And I can still talk while they find it. Is it possible for it on the screen?
Oh, sorry, put it up, I don't know.
Well, it's from the EIA, non-executive summary.
I think we're all aware of that view.
No, but
You got it, Tracy?
If you provide no one here can connect to this.
Well,
we've been dialed in remotely, I think.
Tracy.
I'll see if I can find
Yeah,
it in the HIA.
it's important.
Oh, I don't have those. Oh, yes, I do.
But I'll put while they're finding it.
If you could give us a page number or a reference, I'll see if George remotely.
1731.
I think, John, we've got Tracy's.
Oh, lovely, thank you.
This one here.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, I'm in the HIA at the moment.
All right.
So,
Well, don't worry, I could talk to save time. I could talk while you're
yeah,
finding
just
it.
see if
There
I
you
can
go.
find something similar to
There's
help
one up
you.
there.
Well, I want just
it.
the one that the public have been issued. It's none of
Well,
those.
this is publicly available as well.
It's the one, the environmental
See if it's in.
impact assessment and its scoping and its agreed visual views was carried out by Watermans, and it was submitted to the planning department, and on file it says that they've progressed without it being approved. The important thing is Jersey's looking at diversifying its economy. Its heritage is its lifeline. I mean, the finance industry could or could not, may or may not survive. But its heritage and tourism is its only asset. And what we're looking at here is views of, well, many of the views, but the one I want to focus on is Fort Regent, which has been highlighted. This document doesn't consider at all Fort Regent, at all. So the public have not been informed about the visual impact of this development on Fort Regent. The other aspect, which is important, is when you travel in a car, the faster you go, your view of vision shrinks. On a bicycle, when you're walking with friends, walking along the promenade, you're looking panoramically in every single direction. But if you're on a bicycle racing to work, your view shrinks. Also, if you come here on holiday and you arrive by taxi, and sitting in the back, your view is of the windscreen. And when you arrive by bus, which you should do, your view is there. So what I'm trying to say is that this is not just the views of the island and, an irritants. It is our fundamental financial lifeline. And the important thing is, if people have a bad experience, and it is important, their arrival is the most important experience. And I'm sure you've been the same for you, wherever you go on holiday. If your arrival's bad, your whole holiday's bad, even though you had a good time. But you won't come back, and you won't forget it for 20 years. So the bit I want to highlight here, this is the only photograph given to the public so the public can assess the visual impact on their heritage by this huge development. This is the only photograph. Now, what is the point of this photograph? And, what is its relevance? And this is the fundamental problem. The people the consultants that have compiled this are Watermans. This just so happens Watermans are the same consulting engineers that are being paid by this client to move Will's building, their heritage. So one has to really seriously review, is this planning application adequate? Is this planning application misleading? Has this planning application delivered false information to mislead the public? Has it got omissions? Well, let's just look at omissions. This is prepared by Watermans specifically for the public. And it does not include the loss of views of the heritage sites of one of the most important in the world, of Fort Regent, doesn't include it. And secondly, this is the only view they want allowing the public to assess the visual impact on our heritage. But of course somebody's going to jump up and said, get rid of that thing, it's a fantastic scheme. Has that misled, has that missold the scheme? I leave that for the public to decide. Thank you.
Excuse me, the cafe's in it.
The cafe is in it.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, well that draws us to the end of a long day.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Not quite.
that nearly draws us to the end of a long day. Mr. Nicholson.
Thank you very much. There's just been a few things that I would like to draw out from a policy sense in relation to historic buildings. I might start, first of all, with I had a little moment, something that Ms. Ingle said about the metrics and the way the shoreline was advancing towards Elizabeth Castle. I totally misheard that, to the amusement of the rest of the team on our correspondence here. I think Ms. Ingle said, I thought she said 250 metres, but I think you said 250 metres. The shoreline advances by 46 metres at its maximum position, just for clarification.
My apologies.
Oh, it was my mishearing it. The second element, which I think might have been misheard again, was I think it was me that referred to a blanket being dropped across the existing buildings on the site. I certainly didn't mean a blanket approach to 8 stories. The blanket form is very different to a blanket approach. My colleagues have confirmed that the 8-storey parameter relates to just 25% of the proposed built floor space, just for clarification on those points. The second of my 3 points was something that you raised, sir. You were saying in one of your questions that the application was well trailed by policy, by the urban character appraisal, by the SPG. I think we discussed earlier in response to one of my the points I raised for Mr. Young. In my view, the application is trailed by the existing built context to a large degree. The scale and forms are already there. Third point is something that I I'm a little bit surprised has not been drawn out in the discussions about heritage policy. The position in the previous island plan in relation to the 2011 plan, policy HE1 had a kind of definitive full stop on it. If you don't preserve or enhance a listed building or special interest in its setting, this application will be refused, full stop, to paraphrase. Policy HE1 in the new Bridging Island plan is very different. It includes what I refer to in my own mind as the A to D criteria. In that it includes a mechanism to consider whether proposals that do not protect a listed building or its setting, when they may be supportable. So there is a door that might be opened through the policy, so not a departure from the policy, through the tests that are within the policy. And this came to mind because Miss Ingall's proof has a clear commentary at page 24, section 11, where the overriding public policy references which come out of the A to D criteria are noted. The A to D criteria include, to start off, that the changes are demonstrably necessary either to meet an overriding public policy objective or need. And in Miss Ingall's proof, she comes to a conclusion in 11.2 that there are impacts here, and that given the status of the buildings, which are of the highest grade, then a high bar is set. In relation to this question of overriding public policy, there are, in Miss Ingall's proof, coastal protection is identified as an example of public overriding benefit in the preamble, and she records that the greater the impacts, there will be greater impacts due to the quantum scale and height of the built development. In my reading here, the conclusion is that these benefits are not proven to deliver an overriding public policy need. Now, also included with the proof is Appendix A, and that is the consultation response during the life of the application. And at page 31 of the proof is the latter section of that analysis during the life of the application. This goes into a lot more detail in relation to those A to D tests. So the second half of the page, 31, has them as 1 to 4, replicating the criteria A to D. That discusses a slightly different view on overriding public interest tests. There is some acknowledgement here that the delivery of new homes, a component of which are affordable, meets a public policy need. There is clearly reference to the objectives of the Bridging Island plan in relation to housing. There is reference to the fact that this is embedded to a large degree in the island plan through the Southwest St Helier Framework SPG, and of course we've also had the urban character appraisal. So it's my view that the public benefits include the housing and the degree of new housing. It also includes flood risk protection measures, which indeed the earlier text in section 11.2, coastal protection, is identified in Miss Ingall's proof as an example of an overriding public policy protection. The coastal protection approach will result in a large degree of change, irrespective of the buildings. Raising the seawall and grading everything back in will change the setting of buildings. And of course, one of the key public objectives in relation to this whole waterfront conundrum is connectivity and the public interaction between the old town and the new town. And that is one of the kind of core elements of this application. So in reviewing HE1, I would ask you to keep an open mind in relation to criteria A to D, where a series of tests are set out to examine within policy whether the public benefits outweigh the harm to the special interest of the building and setting, and where the nature of that benefit to the public is clear, direct, and evidenced. And as part of your review of those criteria, I am sure you will refer to both the main proof and the appendix to Ms. Ingall's evidence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I must give her an opportunity to respond. Is this just a matter where you just wait and calibrate things differently?
I suspect it is down to the fact that the policy A to D is not each test or A or B or C, it's all tests.
Yep.
And therefore, my conclusion is different in as much as it does not override the heritage adverse impact on Grade 1 listed buildings and settings of other listed buildings. I appreciate Mr. Nicholson's thorough review of my proof and my earlier responses to the application.
Okay, Mr. Young.
Sorry, sir. I didn't mean to intervene, but having read this policy, it took me back to the Island Plan debate where I was the minister having to take this plan through the state. Mr. Nicholson obviously relies on those extra paragraphs A to D being in the policy. But of course, my recollection, and it's my own recollection, and I think the record will show this, is that the tests in there are very explicit, that there should be no doubt, no argument, and no ambiguity about the public benefits, hence the words clear, direct, and evidence. And it also in the preamble, if you look in the policy preamble, it gives you a lot more explanation about the way that system works. So I don't think it's a sort of a clear-cut issue that perhaps Mr. Nicholson suggests. I think, but, you know, plainly, yes, we have new words in the policy, but in my view, these were put in and they were very, very tight criteria. It was not a policy vehicle to get round or weaken in any way the historic building context, but there are recognising that there are situations where there is an overriding public benefit, but the level of evidence and clarity required in order to be able to demonstrate and justify a decision, I think, is a very high bar indeed. That's my view, sir. But I'm not the minister anymore, but I'm sure the planning officers would do better than me. But that was my recollection of when we had that in the state's debate about those changes.
Drawing attention to clear, direct and evidenced for the benefits, yeah. Okay. Right.
Reach the policy and then we actually understand it later on and find out it's no longer what you thought it was.
Okay, we're going to draw that to a close. That has been quite a long first day. Tomorrow we have another 3 sessions, landscape and the natural environment. I think some of that landscape is going to overlap with some of the things we've heard earlier today, but we'll pick up that and we'll also deal with natural environment, biodiversity and marine ecology. We've got quite a wide range in session 5 on housing, population, employment and health. And the afternoon, likely to be the afternoon session on amenity, which will deal with the effects on existing occupiers and the amenity of future residents. And we'll talk about sunlight, daylight, overlooking, privacy, you name it, it'll be there. Also, we're going to cover wind and amenity space provision. Some of those matters have cropped up in the course of the day, but we'll try and do them justice tomorrow. So thank you all for your contributions today. For those returning, I'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow. Okay, we'll close that.